Happy Sunday. Integrity has two definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary. One relates to stalwart morality. The other definition is the state of being whole and undivided. Last week, we talked about civility, which is defined as courtesy in behavior and speech. For me, the importance of civility is tied to the value of integrity. Integrity itself comes from the root word integer. And for those of us who still remember their grade school maths, which I actually am not in that group, but integer means entire or whole. If you think of integrated or integral, it means whole. So the number 1 is an integer, but 3/4 is not. The heart of the word integrity is the word meaning whole and unfractured. The reason integrity ties to civility is that incivility often leads to a loss of integrity. Integrity with the person you're speaking with, you're not integrated anymore, but also personal integrity. This is actually a common tactic of abusers that you will learn about in self-help books and counseling, things like that. And you might have heard the term dog whistle. If you're not all that familiar with the term, what someone means when they say that an abuser or is using a dog whistle, a dog whistle is to do or say something in like a group or a public setting that's meant to just set the target off, but not the rest of the people. So if this abuser, this person is intentionally targeting you, then they say or do something specifically related to you that the rest of the group won't really hear, as in a dog whistle, or even see. Sometimes it could be a gesture or movement or something. And then like a dog whistle, the sound, it's there. So the group does actually hear it, but they don't process it. They don't really know they're hearing it. But you, as the dog, you're sent howling and braying and making a general scene. You're just, Argh! And everyone around you believes that you're Sturm and Drang or some self-generated thing. They think you've flown into this rage of fit all on your own, because they don't hear that dog whistle. They don't know what you're hearing. You become uncivil. You bark, you bite, and you appear to be a mad dog. In no small part, that's because you've allowed yourself to be fractured. Your reactions aren't yours. They belong to the person blowing the dog whistle. You're just the one displaying the reactions. You're not whole because a piece of you is acting on that other person's behalf and fighting against you. Christ taught that a person cannot serve two masters. When you hand your power of civility over to another, you by definition lose integrity. Who cares? What does that matter? What does integrity matter? And honestly, it's probably not the worst question in the world. Being able to see things from other sides and to weigh two opinions at once inside yourself, that's an attribute, not a weakness. But I think integrity speaks to something different from that. I think it's not about not having empathy. I think it's about not serving two masters, not splitting yourself into a fraction. I think there's something different. And for one, there's honor tied to integrity. So there's a LDS story I found called "The Boy Who Kept Out Wellington," and it was published in Salt Lake in 1891. The story goes like this: an English farmer at work one day in his field saw a party of huntsmen riding about his farm. Concerned that they might ride into a field where the crop could be damaged by the tramp of their horses, the farmer sent one of his workmen to shut the gate and then keep watch over it, and on no account to open the gate. The workman had scarcely arrived at his post when the hunters came up and ordered that the gate be opened. The workman declined to do so, stating the orders he had received, and steadfastly refused to open the gate, in spite of the threats and bribes, as one after another of the hunters came forward. Then one of the riders came up and said in commanding tones, "My boy, do you know who I am? I am the Duke of Wellington, one not accustomed to being disobeyed, and I command you to open that gate, that I and my friends may pass through." The boy lifted his hat, and before the man whom all England delighted to honor, answered firmly, "I am sure the Duke of Wellington would not wish me to disobey orders. I must keep this gate shut, nor suffer anyone to pass but by my master's express permission." Greatly pleased, the Duke lifted his own hat and said, "I honor the man or boy who can be neither bribed or frightened into doing wrong. With an army of such soldiers, I could conquer not only the French, but the world." I don't know why we're conquering the French. It's a fairy tale. I acknowledge that. Acting with integrity isn't always rewarded this overtly, but honestly, it sometimes is. Think of someone you know who always seemed sure of him or herself, not in a cocky, self-congratulatory way, not in the kind of braggadocio, way, but in a calm way that speaks to true integrity. Do you have that person in mind? Try to really think of somebody. I bet that person earned your respect for that calm integrity they had. I know I can think of a few people like that in my life. People who presented themselves with a wholeness of purpose and so didn't shy away from counterpoints when they were presented or lose their civility because they were faced with an uncivil opposition. We often hear of this in the topic of relationship orientations, mildly controversial, but let's dive into it just a hair. And it's a well-known axiom that people who are afraid of being converted to amorous pairing style that is not their normative style, people that are worried about being converted to that clearly are not that assured in their own self-identified preference, right? If you're worried that somebody else is going to convert you, I have bad news for you. So to say that a little more plainly, it's pretty common knowledge that most homophobes are likely to be closeted themselves. But someone who says, "I don't care if Gary down the street is gay, because I'm not. Mine's Gary's business. I mind mine." That person comes across to many of us as more honorable and dignified because he's not parading outside Gary's house and complaining about Gary's love life in uncivil and ridiculous manner. He doesn't need to. He has integrity in his own orientation and lifestyle and isn't concerned about proving the wholeness of himself to anyone, including himself. I've personally found the same to often be true in religion. The preceding example, that's one that I feel like is at least fairly universally accepted. Maybe this with religion isn't as much, but it's definitely been something I've found. The people I have met who argued the most vehemently against other denominations or religions often seem fairly ignorant of the theology, cosmology, and accurate histories of their own faiths. I'm certain it's not universally true, but in my experience, people who educate and investigate their faith deeply tend and accept it, warts and all, they tend to be more accepting of others' faiths and less likely to work people with hard conversion tactics, right? They tend to be less likely to come at somebody with like really hard conversion tactics. And I think that might be because these people that have really accepted their faith, warts and all, who have dug into it, who have integrated it, they aren't trying to convert themselves anymore. They don't need to prove it anymore. It's just part of them. Their faith isn't a fraction, it's a whole. They have spiritual integrity. As I had to last week, I think it's worth noting that I myself am not a paragon of integrity. I say be civil, but then often I'm not. There's a fracture right there. I'm easy to charge with the crime of asking that someone do as I say and not as I do. So I put forward my reverence of integrity and its benefits, not as someone who has mastered it or received those benefits, but as someone who aspires to both. So how do we maintain integrity? If I aspire to it, how do I work towards it? Again, I looked it up, just like I did with civility, and I found a quick list. So the first thing I found was to treat everyone the same. That's an interesting idea. It might sound like an external command, like to treat everyone the same, but I think it's kind of an internal command because it's about being whole and authentic with yourself, which is the definition of integrity we're working with here. I don't know why. I try to think of examples of people for these tips, and Whoopi Goldberg came to my mind here. Maybe you don't like Whoopi, but it's who came to my mind. And because I've seen Whoopi, she's on The View and stuff, so she does interviews, but then I've seen her in the street, I've seen her in all kinds of things, and I've seen her talking to dignitaries and heads of state, and I've seen her just talking to average Joes, and in all instances, she speaks with the same voice and the same general character. Now, she might kind of clean up her language a little more on network TV versus like a cable special, slight changes like that are situationally appropriate, but she doesn't fundamentally alter herself. And that's noticeable. Because she treats everyone the same. She doesn't seem to disrespect or condescend when talking to more average Joe people, nor does she seem to put on airs and act haughty when talking to people who have found themselves in positions of authority, power, wealth, etc. She doesn't have one way of treating the fan on the street who says hello and another way of greeting the Attorney General of the United States. She greets them both with that warm smile of hers in the same way. She's authentic. And it shows in how she treats all people. Her integrity shows in how she treats everyone the same. So that was the first one. The next thing on the list is to admit your mistakes. And that can be hard to do, right? I practice this one. I work on this one hard, to be honest, because it was not always the example I was given, I think, growing up from lots of sources. That's not really calling anyone out, but I always saw people that you would say, oh, wait, that was a mistake. And no, it's not a mistake. I didn't make a mistake. And they would kind of work these elaborate things to try to somehow say they didn't make a mistake instead of just owning it. But that's the next step of integrity, owning your mistakes. And my example for this one, who came to mind, was a cult leader named Andrew Cohen. And I'm not really holding him up as a paragon of integrity, because he's not the greatest guy necessarily. But I do think his history, which I'll just kind of cover here briefly, speaks to this point. Andrew Cohen led a little Eastern thought tinted cult in New York for a number of years, a while back, like in the 80s, 90s. And like any cult, Andrew allegedly exploited his members for slave labor and mistreated them, et cetera, the usual allegations against Andrew and against the cult in general. And as his cult fell apart, Andrew didn't do what most cult leaders do. He didn't like call everybody that left his cult liars and cheats and apostates and say, oh, they're all just bad people and they're lying about me and they're leaving the cult because they've lost their faith. Instead, Andrew was a rare cult leader that he came clean openly to publicly. He acknowledged that he had let the power he had gained as these people's spiritual leader, he had let it go to his head. That he had made up a lot of his own supposed spiritual superiority, and that he had taken advantage of his congregation. And in a lot of people's eyes, that helped redeem Andrew Cohen a little bit. He owned up to his mistakes, which I think sometimes people get that confused. They think owning up to your mistakes is like a loss of integrity, a loss of wholeness, because you're going, oh yeah, no, I disown this bad part of me. But when you admit to it, you actually are owning that part of you. You're taking it in, you're integrating it into yourself and saying, that was me and I did do it wrong. I got that one wrong. So I'm not endorsing Andrew Cohen again. I'm just using him as an example of how admitting your mistakes can be an act of building integrity, because you can't be whole without acknowledging your faults. The last bit of advice that I found on this list is to keep your commitments. I saw this one, actually, this bit of advice echoed over and over again when I looked up integrity, both in secular and church sources. And because I looked at a few lists, actually. And I struggle with this one because I also know that sometimes commitments can be used to warp your integrity. You know, you promise or give yourself over to something, not understanding exactly what you're getting into. And then once you're in, you realize you have to fundamentally break and reshape yourself around that commitment. So that those cults we just talked about a minute ago are a prime example of this concept going wrong. Because, you know, the cult, they love bomb you. They say, oh, you know, you're so great and we love you and join us. And if you commit yourself to us, you commit yourself to that 1,000-year contract, then we will build you up and make you great. And then you give into that commitment. And when you get to the other side, you realize, well, actually, they're asking you to completely break your integrity. And it's not just cults. That happens with people. That happens with everything all the time. But since this bit of advice about keeping commitments in relation to your integrity is repeated a lot, I'm going to give it. And then I'm going to try to find a little bit of something to latch onto in here. And I did it with trying to think of an example. And the example I thought of was Christ, specifically Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Because we all know Jesus wasn't necessarily thrilled about being a sacrificed. He asks for the cup to be taken from him. And it's kind of suggested, I mean, if you take the story as a whole, that it's within his power to remove himself from the situation. You know, if you kind of go with those temptations and stuff, he could fly away, he could turn the nails into snails, or have bolts of lightning rain down on the soldiers whipping him up the hill. I mean, those kinds of miracles were within his ability, but Jesus didn't do that because he'd made a commitment to us. To the very end, he followed through on what he had to do for what he believed in and for what he was, because that sacrifice is the wholeness of the atonement. And so for Christ to be whole, he had to do it. And that then is our integrity. Sometimes we have to commit and step through a door, even when we don't want to, in order to be our whole and authentic selves. Abraham Lincoln famously said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. As people, as a nation, we're called to integrity, to stand together, to work toward the common good, hand in hand. I'll end today's message by recounting my own twist on a little parable that I think you've probably heard 100 times. So you've heard this story. A young man goes to his grandfather. I think normally he's like a Native American or something. He goes to his grandfather. He says that he had a dream about two wolves having a fight. And the boy says that one wolf was kind and friendly and domesticated. And then there was another wolf, and it was fierce and wild and free. And he asks his grandfather, which wolf wins? Well, his grandfather says, the one you feed. Honestly, if that were my grandchild, he'd have been given a different answer, thinking of integrity, because I say feed them both. Then you'll have two wolves to protect you. Be whole, accept yourself, act on who you are, and have integrity. God bless. Have a wonderful week.